It's really about building a story of the long-term impact an organisation is trying to have, and then using the best available data and evidence to reduce uncertainty around that story.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guest is Maria English. Maria is the founder and CEO of ImpactLab, an impact consultancy that is bringing analytical rigor and data feedback loops to philanthropic and government spending in the social sector. This is hugely important because the New Zealand government allocates over $60 billion per annum to these areas. But our current understanding of the effectiveness of that spend and how to improve it is spotty at best. If we get better at optimizing these social interventions, that means things like more affordable housing, better healthcare, improved education, and getting care to those who are most vulnerable. ImpactLab refers to this as an opportunity to improve our SROI, which stands for Social Return on Investment. ImpactLab also works with philanthropic groups to drive better decisions and allocation in their grant making. Maria is excellent at explaining how all of this is done and offers valuable insights in terms of how we collect data, fund its collection, create feedback loops, and get it back onto the ground where it matters the most. I find a lot of these themes are also relevant for the environmental investment and funding space. Our producer told me this is one of his favorite conversations we've hosted of the year, and I agree, it's a good one. Let us know what you think in the comments below. All right, let's dive right in with Maria English. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
So tell me about ImpactLab.
ImpactLab is a social analytics company that works with decision makers in the social sector to help them connect with information that they can trust, use, and learn from to do good better for their communities.
What does that mean, do good better?
Yeah, well, I think it means a couple of things. One thing is just understanding at a deeper level what's the difference we're making to people's lives in the long term. Mm-hmm. And then, okay, where are the chances and opportunities to do even more of that? And of course, that could look a whole lot of ways. It could be about telling your story with evidence to raise funds to be able to grow. It could be about honing how you deliver your service, or it could simply be about motivating your staff and reconnecting them to the purpose of their work so that they are, really enthusiastic to turn up every day and do the complex work that they're doing. So it can look different for every organization, but the bottom line is, how do we empower those on the front line to do the best possible job for those who need it most?
And take me through a bit of the journey, because you've been going at this for a few years now. It keeps growing strength to strength. Paint us a picture.
Yeah, so we started about 4 years ago, and really just, I guess, with a model on a piece of paper. So we use a social return on investment approach. So it's really about trying to understand, for every dollar that's invested in a community initiative, what's the long-term value for society that we can estimate is created by that. So we had a theory about how you produce those kinds of figures. We then worked with about 100 charities and NGOs to test that. And we learned a whole lot of things about what's really needed to build the trust of frontline providers to do this kind of process, and also how the methodology needs to work to connect to the reality of what the work looks like. And that can be quite specific. So to just give one little example, we worked with a youth development mentoring organization, and they were, referring kids out to get their driver's licenses with another provider. But then what they found was, because the kids didn't have a relationship with the other provider, they were disengaging. So they started doing it themselves, the license and driving training, which cost a lot more, but actually it was better for the kids. So we realized from their experience that if a charity is referring services out, we need to be more conservative about the effectiveness of those services.
Right.
So we've just been in this big process of learning from people on the front line to hone the method so that we can measure in a way that's consistent across diverse interventions, and kind of passes the sniff test of the person doing the work being able to look at that measurement and say, yeah, says something meaningful about what we're doing.
Because really what that social return on investment is seeking to do is to quantify the value provided by the investment that you're making, right? You're trying to put essentially a dollar figure on the impact that you're making. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's really, I think, about building a story of the long-term impact an organization's trying to have, and then using the best available data and evidence to reduce uncertainty around that story. And so one of the things we do to achieve that is to quantify various drivers of impact and also the value that's created at the end, because it helps us get specific about what's happening and can we put some objective evidence behind that.
So can you help maybe put a bit more specificity around what is social sector and who kind of are the clients using these types of measurements and research?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the way we think about it is at the center we have families and individuals who we believe have the right to form aspirations for their own lives and to go after those. Now, in New Zealand and in many other countries, there's a portion of people in the community who face a lot of barriers to achieving their aspirations. Barriers from things like poverty, lack of access to healthcare, housing, other key things, and also social isolation and exclusion. So if we've got those people at the centre, then we have charities, providers, sometimes companies who are supporting those people with products and services to help remove barriers and empower them to achieve their aspirations. So that might be a non-government organisation that provides housing, or a youth development group that helps young people re-engage with school. Then we've got kind of a step back from there, the funders who are giving money to those frontline organisations to deliver services that make a difference.
Right.
And there's a lot of different ones. The ones we work with a lot are philanthropists and philanthropic foundations. Government funders, obviously, and also corporate and sort of iwi or tribal funders as well.
Got it. Yeah, because it seems like there's a persistent critique or concern that social investment is not being effective, right? Or it's become too mired in bureaucratic administrative processes, or it's not actually tackling root causes and only the symptoms, or that, for whatever reason, it's not a good return on value. And so my perception is ImpactLab is going in and saying, okay, well, let's actually get our arms wrapped around the best data, information, evidence we can to identify what's effective, what's not effective, how do we improve, and to take us through that story you said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we kind of see a real need for better feedback loops in the social sector. And what that loop is really funders and service providers having a view of where is the money going, who is it reaching, and how is it translating into actual experiences of support for the people we care about. And then on the other side of the loop, what confidence can we have about the long-term difference that funding is making for the lives of those people? Now, we kind of think it has to be an iterative process to build that loop because you've got to start from somewhere. And what we're learning is that organizations often have a lot better and more data than they expect, but equally there's often a lot of key gaps. But if we start with what we have, we can build and improve visibility over time. And we really need to do that because, I mean, in New Zealand's case, we spend $60 billion a year just within government on social services. And for almost none of that spend, do we actually know where the money's going, who it's reaching, or what long-term difference it's making.
Got it. So that's really the opportunity, is the 60 billion plus of capital being invested. Like, how do we do that much, much better?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it seems to me that part of the value that you're having in the ecosystem, as I've watched this unfold over the years, is you're providing some common frameworks between the silos of funders and providers, because we're all kind of grappling to do better at impact measurement and to understand effectiveness downstream. But it is something that has a tendency to be very siloed.
Mm.
And so, can you share more about what you're seeing there?
People are really coming at it from quite different perspectives. If you're the person who's in the room every day delivering the alternative education program versus you're the person in central government making $10 million policy decisions, you've just got different drivers and different contexts. But in this case, I think both people need to know the same thing, which is where's the money actually going? Who is it reaching, and what confidence can we have about the long-term difference it's making? Because that's the purpose of the system,
right.
And so the families and individuals and how the services are impacting their ability to realize their aspirations should be at the center of all decision making. And I think that's what can get us all on the same page, coming from different perspectives, is a shared fact base about the reality of how change is or could be happening for those we care about. And then that can flow through in different ways to decisions, whether that's the decision of a social worker to make the extra phone call to engage that hard to reach family, or that's the decision of the policymaker to, create space for flexibility in the KPIs that providers are reporting on in relation to a certain service.
What drew you into this work? Why did you get excited about this?
Yeah, I've always been really fascinated about the idea of potential, and how do people achieve it. And I was really fortunate when I was studying. I got to work it was really volunteering for a play-based program for kids with autism. I got to play with a little boy. And that was kind of my job, was just to play with him, which is pretty easy. But it really got me because he was quite nonverbal, or had been quite nonverbal. But his mum had really done everything she could to sort of engage and give him opportunities to connect with the world. And as a result of that, he started talking a bit, and he learned how to communicate with a letterboard. And he wrote the most amazing stories. And I would go and play with him. He was 10 when I was hanging out with him. I'd go and play with him, and he could say a few basic words. And then his mum would show me these stories he had written, which were probably I'd say much more sophisticated than what I would have written at the age of 10. And I realized this is a kid who has huge potential, who has a whole world of his experience. And it would be so easy for us in the community to totally not realize that. And that was, to be honest, kind of a terrifying thought. But that also got me thinking about how many other people there are out there who, for various reasons, often to do with the past or traumas they've experienced or collective traumas that their communities have experienced, face that same sort of barrier or set of barriers to being who they can be or expressing themselves and their dreams. So I think that's what really motivates me. But I know I don't have the immense gifts you need to do the frontline work. So I realized the bit where I can help is kind of in the back office of putting good analytics tools in the hands of those who are doing this work.
Right. And so was your background in data science or?
Yeah, a bit of everything. So I studied psychology, politics, and sociology in undergrad. And then I worked as a management consultant at Boston Consulting Group in Australia, which was really my kind of practical and tactical education of analytics for decision making. And then I did my MBA over in California at Stanford and did quite a bit more in the, I guess, data analytics, but particularly technology space. How do you build good, effective technology tools to address social needs? And of course, I had to have a failed startup while I did that. So I tried to start a platform with a friend to connect kids with dyslexia with mentorship and support. But I think, as everyone knows, marketplaces are very hard and it didn't work, but it was a great learning experience and good prelude into ImpactLab.
Gotcha. And where's ImpactLab today? Like, how big's the team and how many clients Yeah, so we, we're still pretty small, but just getting to do such meaningful work. So we've measured over $300 million of investment so far across over 250 mainly charitable programs that reach
about, I think it's like 800,000 New Zealanders at this point. So we're getting kind of a small but pretty good window into the market. And of course, we're applying standardized measurement, which means we can get a really great bird's eye view in a way that hasn't really been possible before of how investment's flowing and the impact it's having. And then really across, a whole range of different kinds of sectors and customers, lots of sort of child, youth and family type programs, a lot in sports and the arts, housing, financial well-being, pretty much anything you can think of that is an aspect of helping someone to achieve their goals. We've got to have an insight to, which has been great. And our team is, I think we're up to about like 18 or 19 people now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so the clients that you serve that come to you that actually like engage ImpactLab, is it mostly the funders or the providers or both?
It's both. Often the funders, often the providers. It kind of depends on the size of the provider, largely. So the medium to larger providers tend to be able to do this kind of work as part of their kind of program. For the smaller ones, that's often where we need funders to support them to do the data work.
Sure.
And, there's many more providers who want to undergo measurement than there are funders. So we've got a wait list of about 50 or 60 organizations right now who they want to put themselves to the test and kind of have that third-party perspective, but they're at a size where they just don't have the funding envelope to put outside of the kind of business as usual.
Yeah. But I guess it makes sense that like a philanthropic foundation could fund this type of impact measurement analytics for its portfolio of grantees, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some philanthropic funders who literally do that. So they'll map their whole portfolio in terms of social return on investment, which is obviously great for their charities that they invest in to get the insight, but also for the funder to get that comparative view of what's the mix of things we're doing here, and sort of is our investment decision connecting to the intent of what we're trying to achieve. We also have some funders who take a more sector-based approach. So we had one, for example, that looked at 20 organizations in the early years sector, which gave them a whole lot of comparative insight about specifically investing in those early years of a child's life, different interventions, different trade-offs of kind of cost versus return, to really help them unpack how do they best support that sector in their region.
Gotcha. So obviously a lot of these measurements are challenging, right? Like you described the child that you were working with and the stories, and like how do you possibly quantify and measure that type of impact, the impact of Maria playing with this child downstream, over the long term. And so what can you share more about the methodology and the approach?
Yeah. And I guess the first thing to say is there's so much that we can't quantify. And there's particularly with the sort of data available, there's so many limitations to what we can capture. Right. But at the same time, we can capture much more than we ever could before. So I guess the way we think of it is really first to start with the story. So if we think of a person's life or a family's life, there's a pathway that life takes. And then at some point, they come into contact with a program or service. And at that point, the opportunity is to shift in a more positive direction the pathway that personal family's life takes. And so what we're really trying to understand is the past, the present, and the future. Where are people coming from in terms of the challenges or goals that they have? What are they actually getting when they're engaging with a service or product? What's the positive shifts that can occur in someone's life as a result? And basically the difference between what we would expect the pathway to be without support and what that pathway can look like with the support that's being provided is what we call social value. And that's what we're trying to quantify. So the way that we do that is we use data from charities and frontline providers themselves, government and academia, to basically build a data story to test that narrative. And so we look at things like, what are the challenges that people are facing? So we know, for example, in New Zealand, if you have a disability and you're unemployed, you're 4 times less likely to get a job in a 12-month period than someone who's unemployed but doesn't have a disability. So we can start to build a picture of kind of what those challenges really look like. When we get to the present, it's really understanding what is this program providing? and what can we see about how many people and to what level they're actually engaging with the program.
Mm-hmm.
And we often see, a program that lasts for 20 weeks, maybe it's a parenting course, but if 30% of people drop out after the third session, then no matter how effective the teaching course is, they're not going to get the benefit.
Right.
And then when it comes to looking forward, I'd say that's where it's there's the most uncertainty. And that's where we draw on academic evidence to say, what's the most analogous, say, longitudinal or high-quality academic evidence that could give us some reasonable assumptions about, for example, if a parent does that parenting program, how likely it is that that's going to transfer into more positive parent-child and parent-to-parent relationships, and perhaps something like a reduction in family violence.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to quantifying of the value. We're almost there. You've stuck it out this long. And quantifying the value, we look at a couple of things. So family income impacts, government avoided costs, and what we call subjective or intrinsic wellbeing impacts. So if you take that parenting course example, we might look for if we can sort of build some evidence to expect a reduction in family violence, then we can look at government data to know avoided police costs, court costs, prison costs, all real future costs associated with that.
Yep.
But also the income impact from the disruption in, say, employment that comes from living in a violent situation. But also the subjective impact, which is probably the most important, of experiencing that violence. And there's theoretical ways to do that. We have to do it pretty cautiously, but we do use some of it because we appreciate that subjective element is often what matters most, for the people who are delivering these services.
Right. So it's always going to be imperfect and abstractions and a bit messy, but it's really, giving us different proxy ways to get those feedback loops to try to understand, how do we be more effective and make the right interventions at the right time and calibrate the success or failure of different programs. Yeah.
And we have to be, I think, really pragmatic about how good a proxy needs to be to support the decision.
Right.
So, for example, I was talking to a housing provider yesterday, in fact, who talked about a refugee family they knew who were in emergency housing for a long time. Their baby ended up in ED at hospital multiple times. They drove to another city hoping they could get housing there. They couldn't. They were living in their car. 6 weeks later, their baby's back in ED, struggling to breathe. Now, we could say, well, we need to run a randomized control trial to test whether it's better for the baby to be living in the car or in a warm, dry, safe house. But there's plenty of existing evidence to suggest, as well as the evidence of, our intuition, that the warm, dry, safe house is probably much better for the baby than the car is. So, that's the kind of situation where we'd say, let's make that an assumption. But there's other things that might be quite pragmatically important to test for decision-making, like how do you actually get, a family engaged with a service when there's a lot of complex cultural and language barriers to overcome? And how can we see that engagement's actually happening through the provider's engagement data? So I think we just need to kind of point the analytical effort in the places that's most critical to the context of the decision. And in terms of what we do at ImpactLab, that's where we focus on standardized, scalable, and comparable measurement, drawing on the deeper work that's often been done. But we still need the deeper work to be done, particularly in areas that are under-researched. So we kind of need, we need a variety of analytical tools in the toolbox.
Got it. Wow, there's so much to do here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So recently you had this charity sector report with Jarden. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it was an awesome exercise. So we worked with Jarden, who are a wealth management organization, to look at over 100 programs that we've measured since we started. And basically just to say, we've looked in depth at over 100 programs and their social return on investment. What can we learn from this that might be particularly useful to investors, donors, and impact investors? And it was great because I think Jarden brought the kind of wealth management mindset, the investment mindset, and we brought the kind of experience of working with these amazing organizations. And so we did the kind of anonymized analysis, and it was really fascinating. Just a few things that we learned. Recommend just checking out the report. But for example, we saw that 13% of the people that we had across a population of, hundreds of thousands, 13% of people were receiving, I think, over 70% of the investment. And that immediately tells you that when we look at the kind of curve of social risk in a population, it's really steep. Like some kids literally need 10 to 20 times more investment in a monetary sense to be able to successfully navigate high school than others because of what they've experienced and the challenges they're up against. So those kind of cost curves were really interesting to look at. And we also found a bit of a pattern emerging in terms of the kinds of social investments that you could make, at least across the set of organizations we looked at. So we saw that some organizations are what we call broad impact. So it's kind of they're providing light touch, quite high scale support for many people to shift the dial a little bit. So maybe that's, a basic financial literacy program in schools. Then we saw balanced impact programs, which are kind of moderate cost, moderate social value, a bit more intensive. So that might be a program that helps a family progressively into home ownership, for example. And then we saw what we call deep impact programs that are much higher cost. They work with almost without exception 500 or fewer people at a time, and that achieve kind of really deep and high levels of long-term social value. So that might be, for example, an intensive housing program for people with severe mental health issues. And so what we kind of saw is it's not that one's better or worse than the other. It's that how you think about the investment needs to be different, quite different, depending on where you're sitting.
And what are some of those downstream implications, like between a broad impact program versus a deep program? How would that, show up in terms of those approaches and strategies?
So one really interesting thing is engagement rates. So with those broad impact programs, they're often really low marginal cost to reach another person. You often want to cast quite a wide net so that you reach the people who need it. And you can afford to reach some people who don't because you're going broad. And so from an engagement perspective, you probably want to focus on reach in an absolute sense, and then just making sure that who is sticking around and engaging are the people that you're trying to help. But we would commonly see, 30, 40% of people on those programs who go onto the website and then leave it and don't engage, right? And that's kind of okay because of the low cost nature of the model. You compare that to deep impact, much smaller programs. Let's say you have, this is an example, we had, 20 guys who've all come out of prison. They're all fathers, and they're trying to really rebuild their sense of identity and legacy to become great dads to their kids and to get their life onto, a different track. Now, if there's 20 of them, it might take quite a bit of investment to get one more of them to stick in the program and complete it. But just getting one more father through that program could totally transform a whole family for multiple generations. Not that we can measure the multiple generations bit, but we can measure certainly the family bit. And so as a funder, it's really worth paying attention to and investing in that marginal increase in engagement. So that's just one variable. There are sort of seven groups of variables in these models and many iterations underneath that. So you can just imagine from an investor perspective, this analytics can really help identify all sorts of opportunities that are kind of hidden when you can't sort of see in a specific sense what's going on. Yeah, fascinating. You also recently had this social investment in the field issue that just went out. Can you tell me more about that? Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion now in New Zealand about something called social investment, which is it's basically an approach to investing or spending money to improve lives based on three principles, which is focusing on the customer of the service, taking an investment-based approach to decision-making, and using data to get a feedback loop. So it's an approach that increasingly government is adopting, but it's also been quite widely used in the charity and social sector in New Zealand for a number of years now. And what we wanted to do with our newsletter series is just promote some real conversation about how do those principles actually apply in the day-to-day of decision-making at policy level, at analysis level and at the frontline delivery level.
Right.
So what we're doing is bringing real examples from the work that we're doing at ImpactLab, kind of as use cases to help stimulate discussion about how do we focus on the customer and make these long-term investment decisions, and how can data help us to do that.
And can you take me through this example around hospitalizations?
Yeah, so that was from our first newsletter. So we did this work, it must have been last year, with a community housing provider who support people with severe and persistent mental health needs. And they were able to get the kind of local health authority to share with them data about the hospitalizations of their housing tenants. So what we looked at was, what were people's hospitalizations before they got sort of appropriate and tailored housing? And then what happened after they got that housing? Because a lot of these people previously were either sleeping rough, living in temporary accommodation or boarding houses, and not kind of getting, the kind of tailored support that they need to sustain a stable housing situation. So we looked at the data, and to be honest, I was really amazed. I thought there would be a bit of a difference, but what we saw was that prior to getting the housing, across these 30 or 40 tenants, they were on average spending, I think it was over 100 nights a year in hospital. So kind of a quarter to a third of their lives, they were living in a hospital bed.
Wow.
And then after they got the housing, that dropped by 90% to 10 nights a year. So that dropped, and then it stayed low for the next 5 years. And we calculated a couple $2 million of savings just from that small group of tenants for the health system, from the fact that they had the appropriate housing.
Got it.
So I think overall it was something like a $3 return per dollar invested, and quite intensive kind of housing support because of the improvement in the lives of those tenants.
Gotcha. So by investing in this type of social housing intervention, we're seeing downstream benefits in terms of cost savings in the medical system.
Yeah.
And this kind of analysis helps to just really bring visible quantification to that.
Yeah. And what's interesting in that example is the benefit became existent very quickly. Like within 6 months of being housed, the hospital bed nights plummet because people are getting appropriate support. And so my kind of emerging view is that there's probably quite a lot of these opportunities where we're just missing a chance to get the right support around people at the right time to then make really quite measurable and distinct changes in their lives, which then, of course, we by proxy can measure through these downstream impacts.
Yeah, my experience when I was in a previous chapter of my life running a Silicon Valley startup, I was always amazed. We had the benefit of really doing product development and website user interactions. So we had tons of data, tons of analytics, and it was very fast feedback loops. And so we were constantly trying to optimize the machine, get the conversion rates up and increase the amount that each customer buys and to afford the advertisements and all these optimizations. And I really learned over and over that, like, one, my intuition sometimes was right and oftentimes wrong, right? And so I would think that this intervention would work or that intervention, whatever, and then the data would come back and it would be different. And I also learned that tiny things can have a disproportionate impact. Like the very first impression that a new customer had would have huge downstream ramifications to the lifetime value of that customer. Or the conversion rate on this one page when they pulled out their credit card would have huge impact on whether or not we retain that user. And it's, I guess hearing you describe these very complex, multi-layered social interventions, across different departments and sectors, and how this impacts people's lives, it could feel overwhelming. But I really do appreciate that we want to make those efforts to try to get more of that evidence and get that story told, because, like you said, there's just a lot of places that we can potentially optimize.
Totally, yeah. And our kind of value for tackling that is use to improve. Let's try and use the data we have and what we do know to build a picture test some assumptions, kick some tires, and then see, okay, where can we improve? Where can we take a next step? Because, of course, producing a set of metrics based off imperfect data is never going to give us the answer. What it is going to give us is the next 5 questions. I'm just thinking, when I heard your example of kind of, doing a startup, I was thinking about a charity we recently worked with who provides support to the families of children who are in hospital with serious medical conditions. And we were doing trend analysis of their kind of long-term impact. And we saw over a 12-month period, the impact per family increased quite a bit. And as we unpacked it, we realized that one of the key drivers was that they were getting more families staying with them for longer in their residences by the hospital. And what that meant is that the siblings of the sick children were getting to benefit from the educational services within the residency. And that meant that if they were staying longer enough to actually see some meaningful difference in their educational engagement, whereas the short stays weren't getting that. And that's just the kind of example of, it's like a 9% increase in families over the 2-week stay mark. But actually there's some real measurable difference. And I always feel like we're just absolutely at the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of the time the frontline team members know this stuff, but they don't have a way of communicating it to funders that can hold weight. Because it's just them saying they know it, right? Whereas getting the data to test or disprove some of the intuitions or challenge them at least, I think creates a much more objective conversation with those funders.
Yeah, exactly. Because the funders need independent voices in the mix to develop that confidence. Obviously, someone who's receiving funding from you might always be communicating something, and you have trust, obviously. But to have independent, objective measurements and voices in the mix only helps to really build that confidence.
Yeah, and I think it's something, no one's ever really fully objective, but it's something we work and are working really hard on, is consistency. And taking a consistent approach so that when we start to see differences between different models, funders can actually interrogate what are the drivers of those differences. And of course, we're still learning. So sometimes we find there are things we need to address in the model so that the distinctions that come through are relevant distinctions and not just mistakes we've made. So that's a constant work on. But I think it also it adds a layer of richness to the conversations, because one person's experience is so rich. But if we can look across, 500 families and then compare that to 15,000 other families that we've kind of previously analyzed experiences of, there's sometimes new insights that can come out of that.
Totally. So, you have such a unique insight into so many of the inner workings of the social sector here in Aotearoa. And I'm curious, zooming out, if we could wave a magic wand and Maria could change different policies or place greater investment in different areas, or what are some of the things that you see as big opportunities, and maybe synthesizing some of the observations in the last 4 years?
Yeah, so I think the first one is just creating more of those data feedback loops. And I think just having kind of support from funders to put some investment into that, because it takes investment to build a bit of a data infrastructure. It doesn't have to be complicated. Yep. A lot of charities can just use off-the-shelf tools, but I can think of a couple right now. They don't have the $8,000 that they need to get a kind of solid CRM in place. And that's just the reality. So I would love to see funding support to get that data feedback loop going. Of course, the funders have to actually read the reporting that they're getting from the charities to make that worthwhile, because otherwise there's no, for most charities, they can't justify spending time on it if they know that it doesn't make a difference to the funder, right? So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is more about what kind of service models are most effective. And this is we're absolutely work in progress, but something we're really curious about is particularly for in New Zealand, it's 15% of the population who face really significant barriers to achieving their aspirations. What kinds of services work best to support those people? And we're seeing some interesting themes coming through as we look at a couple of 100 interventions for thousands of people. And the things that come through consistently are it's models of support that support the agency and autonomy of the person or family and really take that seriously, not just lip service, but really enabling people to be autonomous. For example, we worked recently with a social supermarket, and they are an alternative to a traditional food bank where people can go in and select the items off the shelf themselves.
Cool.
They've got an actual range to select from. It's culturally appropriate stuff. It gives them dignity and agency in what can be a really stigmatizing process. The second key theme is around flexibility. And this is a real problem for kind of traditional modes of evaluation because often what works for people with really complex and specific circumstances to support their aspirations is whatever it takes. And that's we hear that over and over from frontline teams. And that is the reality, families need to be able to turn up in a given week with the priority of the week, whether that's putting groceries on the table, navigating the government benefit system, applying for that job. And they need services that can flex and tailor to their quite unique needs. So that means we have to think differently about procurement and contracting because we can't specify what the service is. We need to specify what the outcome is. And then the third theme is quite an interesting one, which is thinking about the ecosystem of existing relationships around the person we're trying to help. And a really simple example, I was talking to a sort of Polynesian provider recently who do health services, help people with diabetes kind of get on a support program. And they said, look, we have to engage the wider family of this person because otherwise I could be speaking to someone and the actual decision maker about this person's health is not in the room.
Right.
So paying attention to that ecosystem of family relationships, sometimes it's friend relationships, because if services don't understand that, often they can do a lot and not make much progress. And it also means that you can actually help people to not need the service anymore because we all need love. We all need belonging. We all need connection. We all need trusting relationships. But in the best case scenarios, we see services are able to come in, help establish some of that around people, and then they don't need someone who's paid to be there anymore because they've got friends, they've got family who are engaged. So I think, again, that's something that we often don't measure in a direct sense, but is quite critical to long-term and sustainable outcomes.
Love it. Yeah, I'm so pumped. I like everything you're saying. I'm taking through also the environmental lens because so many relevant themes, and I really am taking away from this frame about the story. Yeah,
I'm a big follower of mythology, and I think stories are so powerful because they often illuminate truths where there's a lot of complexity around it, but it kind of illuminates some simple truths in a way our brains can understand. And so that's, I think we're finding that's the key to not getting lost in a sea of data and variables, is getting clear on like, what is that story that we think is here? And then and to what extent can we sort of test that? Now, of course, it's the opposite of the academic inquiry process in a sense,
right?
Which is you don't want to start by just trying to prove what you think is true because you're gonna really miss the chance to test, what you might not have anticipated or expected. But in a kind of a decision-making context, I think you kind of have to go down the route of forming a hypothesis and testing it, because we just don't have 30 years to think about it, especially, the environment's a classic example of that. We don't have 30 or 50 years or 100 years to just kind of go bottom up and see what organically emerges. We've got to form a story of what we think's going on and then rigorously test it.
Is there an example where that really illuminated something where you found a story and then,
Yeah, one of the more difficult things that we looked at is a principal training program. So the program supports principals to build their leadership skills so that they can then support the teachers who can then be more effective in the classroom to make a positive impact on the students.
Right.
And so it's quite difficult to connect what's happening up here to what's happening in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really had to lean on that approach of kind of building what do we think is the story of how change flows through, and what would you need to believe to have confidence that you should be focused on training the principal, rather than, for example, giving the kids laptops or insulating the classroom or all the other things you could spend that money on.
Right.
And it was fascinating because we were able to, through that process, find a few key points in the logic where the organisation really needed to collect better data. And there were other points in the logic where we had good enough evidence to move forward. So, for example, there's quite a good evidence base that improving the efficacy of teachers is an effective way of improving educational engagement and achievement for students. So we could kind of sit okay with that point, but we couldn't sit okay, for example, with the question of, are the principals actually implementing any of the things that they're learning? So the charity we worked with actually went out and interviewed almost all of their former principal alumni to test out the missing bits of the logic, and they learned a lot from that. So I think the story was pretty critical there to just getting somewhere useful for the charity.
Nice.
Probabilistic. I mean,
yeah.
I'm reading a great book at the moment about Bayes' theorem, and because it gets really interesting once you overlay a story with probabilistic thinking and sort of how probability flows through multiple steps of a narrative. And again, so useful for understanding in a context of uncertainty how you might have confidence to take certain bets, in a sense, on investing in different kinds of programs. That can be another podcast conversation.
I was going to say, I'm going to have to really dust off my brain for the probabilistic theory, and I want to ask you about quantum physics and how much the observer affects this. And,
yeah. Probability is probably the most useful maths class I think I ever took, even though it drove me nuts.
Yeah, same. Okay. What else? What else would you like to share? I literally exhausted my questions here.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe it's something we talked about it a little bit, but just we shouldn't underestimate the power of putting data in the hands of the person who's closest to the family. So the kind of social work teams or the youth mentor or the financial mentor. And that's something we've focused on a lot because I think, we can get quite focused on the upstream sort of data flow, which is really important. But there's also a lot of downstream data flow. And what we've found is that particularly the smaller, but kind of all frontline charities find it very difficult to get information shared back from government and also academia to help them improve their practice. So something we do is called good features, where our team look at academic evidence and kind of synthesize, here's some features of effective practice that emerge from the literature that you could potentially consider applying in your service. And sometimes it can be really simple stuff like if it's a service to help people navigate different government agencies, having really good translation services can be absolutely critical and a kind of red line where if you don't have the right language, you just cannot engage with that support. So we pull these effective practices out, we put them in front of frontline teams, and then they can decide and make up their own minds which are relevant to their context, which could they adopt, which are less relevant. But the kind of academic corpus of amazing knowledge is just impenetrable for people who are busy, not kind of book people necessarily, but who do want the insight. And I think likewise with government, I mean, we talked about that example of the housing provider who got a 90% reduction in hospitalizations. The provider didn't know that. They kind of knew it in an anecdotal sense, but until the government actually shared the data back to them, they didn't really know the extent of the difference that they were making. And so I think, there's a real opportunity for government and academia to kind of reciprocate and share that knowledge back. And intermediaries like ImpactLab, I think, are quite helpful in terms of just being able to bridge, as you said, the silos often between these pools of knowledge. And we're just, amazed at the changes we can see that happens for frontline staff when they get this information back. They often cry because they've never had an external evidence point that what they do is valuable. They often kind of get right in the challenge. I think of one lady we worked with who she started looking at her own data through the Good Measure process. And she kind of kept unpicking it and realized that there were a whole bunch of parents in their residential program who they were coming out of really poor living situations into a beautiful residence for a couple of weeks, but then they were just going back into the really poor living situation that they had come from. And she sort of thought, well, why don't we have a referral relationship with a partner who can actually get them better housing? So she just established one. And then she looked at the data about the kids in the child therapy program, and she realized, there's all these kids here who are neurodiverse. We're not giving our staff any training on how to support kids with neurodiversity. Why don't we just implement some training? So she did. And there's all these kind of doers out there who are just hungry for something to come back that can stimulate an inquiry process from which they can then make some real changes. And I think, that's something, again, coming back to the charity getting the $8,000 CRM set up. We can bank real benefit just by empowering those frontline people to search out, just as you did with your startup, those incremental opportunities to do things a little bit better to improve the customer experience.
Yeah. And if I'm a funder and I want to provide more of those analytical infrastructure tools or invest in measurement and sharing data, what are some of the best ways to go about that? Because I know, for example, in my world, often the nonprofits are coming to me asking how to do that. They may not have the technical expertise or, the resources to even go learn about this realm of business intelligence tools and software and data warehousing. And, what advice would you offer in that regard?
Yeah, so I think, in a New Zealand context, that's a lot of what we do at ImpactLab. We've also got a number of organizations that we kind of partner with in the ecosystem, I suppose, that do this kind of work. So, obviously really happy to always connect people with those kinds of organizations. I think having a context like what ImpactLab does with Good Measure is really useful, because otherwise you can, in the abstract, it's sort of hard to figure out, what do I really need? What specs does my system need to have? What's over investment versus not? And so I think what funders can do is help charities kind of get clear, to the extent they want that support, on their strategy, on their mission and their strategy. And then from that, the question is, okay, well, what do you then need to know to really figure out if what you're doing is working?
Yeah.
And then that provides effectively the requirements for the system that you're after. I'm aware as well, internationally, there's some really good repositories online of all kinds of tools and off-the-shelf sort of systems that can do various things. And then I think probably the other thing is talking to charities who do it well. And we certainly see, we see the whole range of kind of data maturity in our work. And there are certainly some just like really impressive organizations that have worked at this and they've made all the mistakes. I think that's another thing. It's often not obvious what the right metrics to track are, or which ones are doable to track. So you've got to try a few things and then sort of zero in, And so I think talking to organizations that have done that, and funders can play that matchmaking role, because they have a bird's eye view. And then that can inspire a sense of possibility.
That's great advice. How much is AI and machine learning affecting your work right now, and how are you thinking about the emergence of some of those advancements?
Yeah, I think it's pretty exciting, especially given just the challenge of having the brain space capacity and resource in the social sector to spend a lot of time in the data. And I think also the importance of qualitative data in the social sector. We've talked a lot about the quantitative, but we've found the qualitative sort of stories and evidence is indispensable to the quantitative process. And also there's just all sorts of insights you get just from, simply asking people what the experience of a service was that you're not going to get from counting widgets. And so I think the kind of the language processing possibilities of AI, I've seen some really cool tools coming out where, you can load in just open field survey responses for thousands of people, and then it can do a lot of the thematic analysis for you. So I guess the way I see it is it's just hopefully will collapse the cost of, quite useful analysis of large amounts of qual and quant data. What I guess remains to be seen is whether it can also do the interpretation layer. because, it's one thing to make sense of the data, but then to put it into the context for a decision maker is something else. But, I'm sure we'll get there over time. What I just hope is that we don't see what we've seen with other rounds of technological advancement, which is that the charity and social sector is sort of 20 or 30 years behind the private sector in terms of being able to reap the benefits of improved, more efficient, more streamlined systems. And I think that, it takes people like yourself who are interested in technology, but also interested in social and environmental change, to bridge that gap and bring the tools in. And of course, we have to think about the ethics and the data sovereignty that surrounds that. But I think that's hard thinking that can and should be done to get people the tools that can help them do a better job.
Yeah, I really resonate with this notion of the collapse of cost and just the sheer amount of compression and synthesis of very large quantitative and qualitative data sets that's going to be potentially possible. And I think if we find the right ways to apply these tools, we can probably learn a lot and advance a lot of things, more rapidly. Any key challenges or roadblocks that ImpactLab is facing? Like, where are you at as an organization? And what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think probably what keeps me up at night is it's getting the balance right. So we're a kind of a mission-driven organization, but we also want to be sustainable and able to invest in R&D and grow the impact of our work. And that's a real kind of tightrope walk of keeping the mission really clear and continuously doubling down on it, while also figuring out, what's the sustainable model to do this kind of work, and how do we get the right balances in place so we can work with, as we have been recently, a guy who's working from his mum's garage to help families navigate the court system.
Hey, don't diss garages too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, you guys should come and do a reno on his garage because I think he would really like that. But he was running off basically, I don't know exactly what it was, but it might have been sort of $50,000, $40,000 a year. And then he was able to go through the good measure process, kind of get this evidence base to support his story, and then tripled his funding. And as a result of that, he's hired an admin person. And now he still stays up pretty late because he's a full-time carer for his mother. But he stays up less late. He gets a bit of sleep because he can pay someone to do some of the paperwork. So how do we balance, getting the tools to people like that who really can do a lot with a small amount, while also having a model, that can sustain itself and sort of enable us to hire great talent. So I think, that's probably a key thing that keeps me up at night. And the other is, kind of introducing measurement to a sector that doesn't have a lot of it.
Right.
Is we just have to be so humble about what we can capture, about what we can do, what the data quality is that's available, and we have to be constantly honing and improving on actually how we do what we do. Because it's a hard thing and it's a complex thing, and when we're trying to do it at a scalable and cost accessible point, in terms of price, there's a lot of trade-offs. So we've just got to constantly hone and be really aware of the limitations, and also educate the market on those, because there's no silver bullet here. There's no magic pill that tells you the answer. It's not like one of those balls you shake. And it just, is this thing effective, yes or no? There's a lot more to it than that. So just getting that right. And recruitment is the other one, which is probably every startup CEO would say. Just getting great talent and supporting that talent to grow and develop, because, that's the team is the work. So that's a big focus of mine.
Nice. Super exciting work. I can't wait to see what's next. Any final messages you want to share?
I think just something I've noticed especially when I talk to kind of general audiences, there's a lot of skepticism, I think. Sort of skepticism and a sense maybe of hopelessness even about the scale of social problems that our societies face, and skepticism about the ability of frontline providers, whether they're companies, social enterprises, or charities, to tackle those. And what I'd like to share is probably just, I feel a lot more optimistic, I notice, than most people. And I think it's because I'm meeting people every week who are, one by one, family by family, supporting and empowering people to make sometimes transformational change in their lives. And, just some of the stories of people in the most unimaginable circumstances who are able to, despite everything, move forward and find a pathway towards, a fulfilling life. It just gives me so much hope that it can be done. And also that there's so much more that could be done if we really took the time and effort to understand what's working, what are the needs out there, and get that feedback loop running for the substantial investments we're already making. So I think it's a challenge, and it's a encouragement of hope that, we can shift the dial on a lot of these big problems. But to do that, we need to connect up our decisions to what's going on out there and find those people who will stay up till 3 a.m. or take the 6th phone call or do what needs to be done to support people on that journey of making change in their lives.
Maria English, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Maria. You can learn more about ImpactLab at impactlab.co.nz. For more great conversations like this one, go to maearth.com. If you're getting value from our channel, I invite you to like and subscribe, join our newsletter, and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.